Good morning and welcome to FAM. I see that my wife came in, and so I need a few minutes to edit my message because she's not normally in here, and so I can say all kinds of stuff about her. But no, I don't have to edit my message. But welcome to FAM Church. It's great to have all of you guys here this morning, and we're excited that you're here. And at FAM Church, we're here to help lead people of all backgrounds to become fully devoted followers of Jesus. We're here to see the men and the women and the youth and the children of Mulberry follow God with all of their lives, with all of their hearts, with all of their passion. And if you're a first-time guest with us this morning, we hope that your experience has been amazing. And we're glad that you're with us. And if you're sitting in here this morning, you go, you know what, I kind of feel out of place in church because church just isn't my thing. And I've got struggles and temptations and stuff that I face. And you guys just don't get those things. Can I tell you, no, we get those things. All of us have been in that spot. We face the same struggles and temptations as you have. And we know what you're going through. We're here this morning to help. And we hope all that you've experienced this morning helps you on that life journey that you're making. And helps you to connect with Jesus in a way you've never experienced before. And so this morning, actually the last couple of times I've spoken, I've actually talked about a guy named Moses. And so this morning, instead of talking about books that Moses has written, we're actually going to talk about Moses this morning. Now, before we get into Moses, and we're talking about previous messages, I just want to mention something to you. I know that in the past, the only way you could listen to or view previous messages was if you went to YouTube or our myfamchurch.com and clicked on the tabs and watched the videos. Well, we've got these now, so they're podcasts. And so they're on iTunes and they're on Stitcher Radio if you're an Android person. And so you can go out, you can subscribe. And so if audio is the way you'd like to get the messages rather than video on our website, we now have that available. It's just FAM Church, and it allows you to download it and listen to the messages at your convenience. So back to Moses. All right. So Moses is the guy that tradition tells us wrote the book of Genesis that we've been in the last couple of times that I've spoken. And so Moses himself, we're going to get to know him a little bit better today. And here's what's interesting about what we're going to look at today. See, many people, when they write or they discuss themselves, when they talk about themselves, when they talk about who they are as a person, they usually paint themselves in an amazing light. I mean, have you ever had a conversation with somebody when there's a conflict between two people and you talk to the one person and you say, what happened? And they just tell you how innocent of an angel they were in this situation, and the other person was a terrorist psychopath, and that's why there's all these problems that the two of them are having. You guys seen that? You've been there, done that, right? And so what's interesting about this is if Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, as I have said the last couple of weeks, when you look at the stories that you've got in there, Moses really does not paint himself in that great of a light. I mean, Moses talks about the days that he murdered somebody, okay? Moses talks about the 40 years that he ran from the cops. Okay, and in saying this, I'm not saying that, hey, it's okay for us to murder somebody or run from the cops. That's not the point in this. The point is that Moses, despite all of these crazy things that he did, but despite all of the stupid things that he got involved with in his life, God used him amazingly and incredibly. And see, no matter what our past is, no matter what has happened in our past, God can take our past and He can change it around in our present and use us for great and mighty things. You see, our God is the master of the turnaround. Our God is the king of the comeback. Our God is the one who can take any situation, take any person and look at them and see that they're not too far gone and turn them around and use them for great and mighty things. And so if you're sitting here this morning saying, I'm too far gone for God, no, you are not. At least as far as I know, you haven't killed somebody and run for the cops for 40 years. God has a plan for you. You are never too far gone. So in digging into what we're going to look at today, the question I want to start with is, how many of you have ever made a bad decision in your life? Do we have anyone who's made a bad decision? Where we've looked at ourselves and we've said to ourselves, oh, why was I so stupid? Or maybe we've made a series of bad decisions, okay? Well, my life is kind of a story of bad decisions. And I'm going to tell you about one bad decision that I made when I was 15. And here's the story. My friends and I had decided that we needed alcohol, okay? And so we had one of our friends whose mom and dad had a very large liquor cabinet. It was massive. And so this was our plan, okay? We went and we got little plastic containers, little plastic things with lids on it. And we went to their house and we went through all of the liquor and we just poured just enough so that they wouldn't notice any was missing from the bottle, but enough so that we could have some, okay? And we went through this whole process. They had so much booze that we poured enough alcohol in these containers that it could have gotten the seven of us that did this drunk twice. Okay, it was just a lot of alcohol, and we skimmed it off, and we weren't caught. And we thought to ourselves, hey, we got to celebrate this victory that we just won by stealing alcohol from our friend's parent. Okay, and so we're just like, what do we do? Well, we decided to celebrate. We were going to toilet paper someone's house. How many of you do that in celebration? Greg and Melissa got married yesterday afternoon. And so I'm just wondering if they went and TP'd someone's house last night in celebration of their marriage, if you got TP'd last night, ask them before you leave church today, because it could have been them. But that's the way we decided to celebrate. But here was the deal, okay? We had to get toilet paper in order to accomplish this. We were 15, we didn't have jobs, and the thought was, well, maybe we could steal it from our house. But it's kind of hard to do that. I don't know. Moms seem to track usage of all products in the house and know when something's being used too fast, right? And so our thought was, well, if we go to our houses and steal toilet paper, our mom is going to wonder what's going on, why toilet paper is disappearing so fast. She's going to say, hey, I just bought toilet paper like 3 days ago and yours is gone. What's going on? And plus, I had some challenges on sneaking stuff out of my house. I'd tell you those stories. We don't have time for them. But every time I tried to sneak something out of my house, I got caught. I got busted. I got busted trying to take beer out of the house. One time we're trying to shaving cream one of the kids on the last day of school, and my mom caught me with the shaving cream. I was so ticked because I thought I did a good job. But anyways, and so we're like, okay, how do we get this? And so we come up with a plan. Now, this was back in the days when they didn't have locking toilet paper dispensers in businesses. Our thought was, we're going to hit all of the local restaurants and steal all of their toilet paper, okay? So we went to McDonald's, we went to Burger King, we went to Perkins, we went to Dairy Queen, we went to this place called R.J. Rich's, we went to Taco John's. Does anybody know Taco John's in here? It's this western half of the country taco place like Taco Bell, okay? We went to that place. Every place that we could think of, we went in there and we stole toilet paper. And we ended up with 27 rolls of toilet paper, okay? 27 rolls. And another friend of mine, he got some black spray paint and he got some soap, and so we were all set. We had our celebration ready to go. We're going to put 27 rolls of toilet paper in someone's trees. We're going to spray paint their house, and we're going to draw on their driveway with soap. I was a great person, wasn't I? You guys, all of you guys are like, God, I'm glad you weren't my kid. And so we did this. We actually went out and we executed this plan, okay? We totally put all 27 rolls in one guy's yard. We put the spray paint on the garage and we put the soap on the driveway. And you may be wondering about the soap on the driveway. In Minnesota, where I grew up, the driveways are made out of asphalt, not concrete. I realized that if we made them out of asphalt down here, they'd melt into pools of liquid in the middle of summer, but it's not quite that hot up there, so it doesn't do that. And so you take this blacktop with soap, white soap, and it writes very well, and it's very difficult to get off. And so that was our plan. We did it. We executed it. We celebrated. And it was fun until about a week later when the cops called. Cops called our house, and it became a decision I wished I wouldn't have made. But see, that decision and many like it that I made were before I'd given my life to Jesus. And so when we look at Moses and we look at some of the bad decisions he made, they were before he'd committed himself to God, God's purposes, God's ways, God's plan for his life. It was before what we call the burning bush experience. And if you want to know about that, go to Exodus chapter 3. You can read that story there. But Moses had an encounter with God, and Moses said to himself, you know what, God, I'm giving myself to you. I'm giving my life to you. I'm dedicating myself to your plans and your purposes for my life. And so Moses became the God guy at that point. And so I have a feeling that when we look at this text today, some of you are going to find it disturbing, a little concerning. And so with that, we're going to turn to the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to be in chapter 34. Deuteronomy is part of the Old Testament. It's the fifth book of the Bible. You got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, then Deuteronomy. If you can't find it, our computer is working today. Greg worked really hard on that this week to get the computer and lights back functioning. If you weren't here last Sunday, we had a technological disaster in the sanctuary. And so it will be on the screen behind me. If you're here today, you don't have a Bible and you'd like one, stop by Fam Connections on your way out the door. They will put a brand new Bible in your hands. We're going to read verses 1 through 8 of chapter 34. And this is what it says there. It says, "Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, 'This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it.' And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over." All right, so as I had already said, tradition tells us that Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy. However, I know for a fact that Moses could not have written Deuteronomy chapter 34. How do I know that? Because it tells about his death and his burial and his funeral, okay? I mean, think about that. How creepy would that be if Moses was able to write about his own death, burial, and funeral? Okay, I mean, I guess God could have done that. God could have spoken it to him and he could have written it down. I mean, maybe Moses' ghost could have come back from the dead and gone to his writing table and wrote it all down so it was there. Or possibly his skeleton gotten up from the ground. Anybody ever have that happen before? You know, the skeleton come out of the grave, go to the office and start writing down the rest of this chapter, and maybe that's why they couldn't find his body, you know, that his skeleton had gotten up out of the grave, and because his brain was gone, he didn't know where to go back to, and so he just laid down in any hole he could find. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities here, but we know none of those are the real possibility. I mean, Moses just didn't write this last chapter, or this last chapter in the book of Deuteronomy. The logical choice and guess would be Joshua, the guy who became the leader of the nation of Israel after Moses died, but in reality, we have no idea who wrote this last chapter. All right, so the text. When we were reading this section, the thing that jumped out at me was the fact that Moses was not allowed to cross over into the promised land. I mean, I found that kind of weird because Moses, this is what he was about. He had endured so much in order to get to this place, in order to get to this spot, in order to get to this time in his life to bring the Jewish people off over into the promised land. I mean, just think of enduring what he went through. If you don't know the story, I mean, these people griped and complained and moaned all the time. They had something to complain about. Imagine leading 500,000 people who did nothing but complain about you. How many of you would quit? I would quit. I wouldn't want to listen to it. And that's Moses. He finally finishes this thing. He gets to the end of this thing, and God says, "Hey, buddy, guess what? You're not going into the promised land. You're going to die right here." I mean, it's just kind of a crazy event because even God on a couple of occasions was ready to kill the Israelites. Okay, in Exodus 32 and Numbers 16, he wanted to wipe them out. Now, I realize the thought of God wiping out almost all of his people is a little disturbing. Wish we had time to dig deeper into that, but if you have questions, you can email me. Pastor Brian at myfamchurch.com. We can dialogue about that. But Moses took a lot of junk for God, so why was God keeping him from the promised land? I mean, that just doesn't seem fair. That just doesn't seem right. That just doesn't seem to be the best thing. And so what's going on here? Well, to figure out what's going on here, we need to turn to a different spot in our Bibles. We need to go to the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is just before the book of Deuteronomy, and we're going to be in chapter 20, and we're going to read verses 1 through 13 in Numbers chapter 20. And this is what it says. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rocks, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and where he was proved holy among them. All right, so let's back up to the first sentence here. And the first few words, it says, in the first month, but it doesn't give us a year. And the reason I believe that it doesn't give us a year is because this is the first month of their last year of wandering in the desert. And here's the deal. The Israelites spent 40 years, as Moses is their leader, wandering in the desert because of the events that took place back in chapter 13 of this same book. And we're not going to turn back there and read it, but what happened was the Israelites, God had led them out of slavery in Egypt right up to the edge of the promised land, okay? And they got to the edge of the promised land, and God said, "Okay, here's the land. What I want you to do is I want you to send some spies into the land to check it out. I don't want you to think that I'm trying to sell you some swampland in the Everglades that has no use to it. I want you guys to go in and check out the land." And so they sent these spies into the land, and the spies went through the land, and they spent days, they spent 2 months in the land exploring it, and they came out and they said, "Listen, people, this land that God is giving us is amazing. It's incredible. It's got fruit. It's got everything that it says that God told us that it was going to have. It's all there. Except one thing. There's giants there." And the people, at the sound of hearing about the giants, they freaked out. Even though God told them he would be with them and lead them to conquer the promised land, they wanted no part of it. God said, "Let's do this." And the people said this.
"No thanks, I choose life."
Okay. And so God said to them, "Okay, fine. You choose life. That's your choice. This generation is going to spend the next 40 years wandering the desert until this generation is dead." See what happened there? They thought they were choosing life in not going into the promised land, and in actuality, they were choosing death. And see, when we decide, when we look at our lives and we make a decision and we say, "You know what, God, your way is not as good as my way," we're doing the exact same thing. We are choosing death when we do that over life and what God has for us. But not only were they choosing death, but because of their disobedience and saying no to God, there was this consequence of wandering through the desert aimlessly. I mean, try and picture that in your brain. I mean, not many of us have been to the desert. I know Jason's been to the desert, and I've been out to the desert in Arizona, and it is hot, and it is dry, and it is rough. I mean, I couldn't imagine somebody saying, "Hey, the next 40 years, you're just going to wander through the desert." Okay, that would be a miserable, miserable punishment. And so the people are like, "Oh, man, we just spent a couple of years in the desert. There's no way I want to spend the next 40 years wandering through a desert with this guy Moses because he's such a deadbeat. He can't get us food. He can't get us water. He can't get us anything else that we need." And so they said, okay, Moses, we got this. Listen, we're going to go up and take the promised land. And so they gathered all themselves together, and they decided that they were going to go up and they were going to take the promised land, even though God had already said what the punishment was going to be. And it ended in disaster. They were defeated, and they were defeated badly. And in our lives, this is something we need to remember. Saying no to God and then getting into the consequences of the decision of saying no to God and then saying to ourselves, "Oh, wait a minute, God, maybe your plan was a better plan," doesn't work. God's not going to say, "Okay, now you're ready for my plan. Let's back up and do it." See, what God does at that point is he says, no, since you said no to me in this case and in this situation, there's obviously something on the inside of you that needs some work, that needs some digging out, that needs some pulling out. And so what I'm going to do is you're going to go through this consequence in order to get whatever it is that caused you to say no in the first place out of you. I mean, that's how God works. He tries to perfect us. He tries to clean us up. And so when we get in situations where we're saying no to him and rebelling against his plan and purposes, he's like, okay, we're going to go through this thing right here, but it's to get that thing out of you that kept you from doing what I wanted you to do in the first place. And so that's why the Israelites were going to have to wander through the desert, not so that God could say, see, you should have said yes to me, but to get that thing out of them that had them in a place where they said no to God in the first place. But back to Moses here. He was being kept out of the promised land because he struck a rock 2 times that he was supposed to speak to. And I can see wheels turning in people's brains and people saying to themselves, what? That's it? He's hit a rock with a stick a couple of times and God is saying, sorry, buddy, you're not going into the promised land? I mean, what's the big deal? The rock wasn't hurt. The rock didn't get a bruise. He didn't bleed. They didn't have to take him to the ER. They didn't have to call in medics to take care of the rock. The rock was just fine. Probably didn't even feel the hits. As a matter of fact, Moses probably should have smacked some of the people with that stick rather than the rock. God, you just need to take a chill pill here because you're always so uptight. You're always so angry. You're always so ticked off, man. The punishment. You're always punishing people. Man, have the punishment fit the crime. But the first thing that we need to see here is that God was very clear on how he wanted Moses to handle the situation. He was to speak to the rock. And because Moses smacked the rock, he disobeyed God, and disobedience to God is sin. And I know that the thought is, come on, it's not a big deal. And I know part of the reason that we think that is because we live in a world that classifies wrongdoing, right? You know, if you what am I trying to say? We live in a world that classifies wrongdoing, and some of the wrongdoing that we even think about, we just kind of dismiss. You know, it's not even a big deal. I mean, we think about how many of you, when you're driving on the highway, or have been told this anyways, that when you're driving on the highway and the state patrols are out there trying to speed trap people, they're only looking for people going over 80. I've heard that many times, and to be honest, I've gone through many speed traps going 78 or 79 and not gotten pulled over. And so I tend to believe that's true. But what's the law? What's the rule? 70 miles an hour, right? And so we say to ourselves, oh, the speed limit's not that big a deal because they really don't enforce it that hard. Or the person who is supposed to start work every day at 7:30 in the morning, but they punch in at 7:32 every day. It's not a big deal. Nobody says anything. It's only 2 minutes. Or we try to watch movies and listen to music that we should be paying for, but we're trying to find it for free. Why are we doing that? Well, those guys, they make so much money anyways. They don't need my money. And I said this one time in a youth service. I did a message about stealing and talked about pirating movies and songs, and the kids just about lost their minds. They thought I'd come straight from the pit of hell when I told them that it was stealing. But see, we look at things and we say, man, those things aren't a big deal. I mean, they're really not a big deal. I'm not really hurting anyone, and that's kind of how we judge things. I'm not really hurting anyone, right? But here's what we miss. See, God doesn't play like that. You see, when God sets boundaries, they're pretty clear, pretty cut, and pretty straightforward. He doesn't set a rule, and then if we break it, he doesn't just wink at us and say, hey, man, it's all good in the hood. You're all right. You got this. You see, when God asks us to do something, when God sets boundaries and rules, it's not just a suggestion for us to follow. Okay, but it's a fast rule that we can't play around with, unlike what we do with the speed limit or the time that we arrive at work. When God asks us to do something, he wants it done the way he is asking. And anything short of that is sin. And I know that some of you are thinking, gosh, this is so ridiculous. God's got mental issues. This is why I understand why people don't like the church and don't like God, but he doesn't classify sin like we do. You know, we think there are big sins and there are small sins, and the small sins are the things that we think are really not that big a deal and God's not concerned with. And the reason we think that is just because how we view crime and punishment. Murder, you get life in prison. Steal a pack of gum, what happens to you? But with God, stealing a pack of gum is the same thing as killing someone. And there's not a book in heaven where he classifies sin. You know, there's not a book that he sits up there with and he goes, let's see, what are you doing? You stole a pack of gum. Let me look through my book. Okay, I found the not really bad sins in here that you don't need to worry about. Steal, pack of gum, in there. All right, I won't worry about that one. Then the next time you lie to your boss and you call in and you say you're sick, but really you're going to the beach. And so God goes, lying to the boss. Let's see. It's not in that first section. Here's the second section, sins that aren't good, but I can live with, lying to boss. White lies. White lies are always okay, right? Okay. All right, and then he's like, oh, you murdered somebody? That's in the really bad section in the back, and you're going to hell right away. It doesn't work like that. You see, God is pure. God is holy. He cannot be in the presence of any kind of sin. It doesn't matter how we look at it here on earth. Sin is sin. He can't be in the presence of somebody who tells white lies, a person who gossips, a glutton, a person who constantly overeats, or a murderer. Okay, it's all the same. In this world, there are different consequences for different sins, but to God, sin is sin. And the penalty for sin is the same regardless of what it is. Romans 6:23 says, for the wages of sin is death. Okay? And so here's the option. You steal a piece of gum or a pack of gum from 7-Eleven. Guess what the punishment is? Death. Okay, that's kind of disturbing, right? But unfortunately, that's how it works. And so what Moses did in hitting the rock versus speaking to the rock deserved death. I mean, think about that. It was God's grace in actually allowing him to continue on to lead the people up to the edge of the promised land. Because you know what happened to Aaron, his priest, his brother? When this event took place, if we're to continue reading in Numbers chapter 20 where that event's at, he died right there on the spot. They took him to a place and he literally died right there. And I know that this is just making my case worse and worse for God being an extremist. But the only reason we think that he's too extreme is because we want the freedom to disobey God and sin without the consequences for doing it. And that's not a game that God plays. And because that's not a game God plays, someone else had to finish for Moses. See, Joshua had to lead the people into the promised land. That was supposed to be the crowning achievement, the pinnacle of Moses' life, but instead it ended up being his biggest failure. And I think that many followers of Jesus end up in the same place as Moses. They don't listen to God in places and areas of their life that they don't want to listen to, and it costs them the things that God wants to do in and through their life. Man, don't let that happen to you. Don't let the small things of life, the things that we look at and say, oh, that's okay, that's not that bad, that's not a big deal. Yeah, God says that in his word, but it's really not that important. Don't let those things be the things that keep you from what God has for you. Because they're going to be the things that are going to keep you out of God's plans and purposes and promises, the destiny that he has for your life. So look at the small things and watch the small things. The second thing that I see here is that maybe what happened was Moses let his insecurities get control of his life. What do I mean by that? Well, if we were to turn in our Bibles to Exodus chapter 4, there's a story of a conversation with Moses and God. And here's how the conversation goes. God says, Moses, you're going to go and stand before Pharaoh and speak to Pharaoh. And Moses says, no, I'm not. I can't speak. I'm not good at speaking. They literally get into a heated argument over this. And so finally God just gives up and says, you know what, Moses? Fine, I'm going to send your brother to be your spokesman. See, he had insecurity about his abilities to speak, we don't know what they are. People have said all kinds of different things. We don't know what those things were that caused him to be insecure. But Moses did not think he had the gifts and abilities to stand before Pharaoh and speak for the nation of Israel. And so picture a man who's insecure about his ability to speak, getting up before a nation of Israel and standing on this rock. And God says, Moses, speak to that rock. The thought in his head is, I can't do that. I can't do that, God. You know that I'm struggling in my speaking, and so you know what? Let me just hit this rock and bring water forth from it. And because of those insecurities in his life of who he was and what God called him to do, it caused him to sin. And I can totally relate to that. I mean, even with the events that have happened in the last couple of weeks here at Fam Church, I totally get what Moses was going through. I mean, first we had an amazing Mother's Day Sunday with our speaker, and I know that you were all excited about hearing from Lisa on that Sunday, and then the video of her speaking, it hit our YouTube page, and it hit our Facebook page, and it hit our website, and the next thing you know, she had 258 views of her message, and my biggest message has received 49 views. And the one that I did the week before Lisa spoke, 3 views. And the thoughts started to run through my head, wow, they really like Lisa's preaching. Maybe they should have hired her to lead the church because they're watching her over and over and over and over again. Then the following week, Pastor Dan was here, and nobody was missing church that Sunday. He spoke a powerful word. It was so powerful, and the anointing carried on so much that last week, most of the people that were here, including our own church family, didn't show up for church. The room was even emptier last Sunday than it is now on a holiday weekend. And both of those things made me start to think, why are you even here? Don't seem to want you here. They want Lisa. They want Pastor Dan. Maybe I should step out of the way so that they can have those people. But here's the thing. I mean, that's my insecurity starting to surface. And if I would have followed through with what I was feeling, where would I have been at? See, I would be in the spot that Moses is at right here in this text. I would have been disobeying what God had wanted me to do, because the thing that you got to hold on to sometimes in places is that God has called you to that, and that's what I had to hold on to. And I know that if I would have walked away, if I would have stepped away, that I wouldn't have realized God's plan, God's purposes for my life in leaving this church. And somebody else would have had to come in and finish what God is calling me to do. And I have a feeling that many other believers are doing the same thing. Their insecurities are dictating their obedience to God. God has said to pray for this person, but I'm not comfortable praying for people out loud, and so I'll just skip that. Well, God told me to talk to this person about Jesus or about Fam Church, but I can't do that because I can't talk to people about those sorts of things and Jesus, and I can't do that. It's going to make me weird. Or I don't want to have to commit too much to Jesus because I'm afraid of being committed to anything except my own life. Don't let that happen. Don't give in to your insecurities. Don't allow them to keep you what God has for your life. Push past your insecurities and do the things that Jesus is speaking to you. And the last thing I see here that could have led Moses to sin was he just went with what he knew. What do I mean by that? Well, this is the second time that God told Moses to bring water from a rock. First time was in Exodus chapter 17. The situation was the same. They're walking in the desert, and the people were thirsty, so they started to get mad and complain. So God tells Moses to bring some water out of the rock, and this is what it says. I'm just going to read it. It's Exodus 17, 5-7. It'll be on the screen. It said, "The Lord answered Moses, 'Go out in front of the temple, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff to which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and the water will come out of it for the people to drink.' So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, 'Is the Lord among us or not?' In the first incident, Moses was instructed to strike the rock." Joe, if you could come on up. Here's my thought on this. Did Moses maybe doubt the word from God in the second situation? Did Moses maybe think to himself, I thought God said to speak to this rock, but the last time I did this, he had me hit the rock, and so maybe I heard God wrong. Maybe the lamb I ate last night is coming back to haunt me. And I just thought God said to speak to it, but really he needed me to hit it again. Well, I better play it safe and do what I know. And doing what he knew caused him to not finish the race and lead the people to the promised land. See, he questioned what he heard God say to him because it was different than what it was before. And see, many times we do the same thing. See, we live in a society that values safety. We have to keep our kids safe. We have to keep our spouse safe. We have to keep our house safe. We have to keep our country safe. And yes, safety is a good thing, but we got to keep power tools that are dangerous by nature, and we try and find a way to keep them safe. I mean, it's just how we are. We've got this concept in our head that safety is some sort of virtue that we're supposed to chase after. But can I tell you, there's nothing safe, and I've said this before, about living your life following Jesus. He will tell us to do things we've never done before. He will tell us to talk to people that we would never want to talk to. He will tell us to go places we would never want to go, and he'll challenge us to live a life of risk. He'll tell us to do ministry the way we've never done it before. And see, when we're unwilling to do things in a different way, we miss out on God. Do you know that 80% of the churches in the United States are dying? Do you know why most of them are dying? Because they grabbed onto a model of ministry when the church was started, whatever year it was, 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, and they won't change. They say to themselves, well, God did it this way 50 years ago. He's still going to do it this way now. No, God does things different all the time. God is never locked into a box on how things are supposed to be done. And Moses, he could have been in that very spot and thinking to himself, well, wait a minute, God's not going to do something different here. He wants me to do it the same way that I did it last time, and so I better do it that way. But when we don't change, when God is asking us to change, it's sin. And so the question for all of us this morning is this: where in our life are we striking that rock? Where in our lives are we standing there and saying, you know what? It's only a small thing. It's not an important thing. I can strike the rock because it's so small. Or where are we standing over the rock with our insecurities and saying, God, I can't do that. You need to do it the way that I'm doing it right now. Or where are we in places where we're saying with God, God, we can't change the way we're doing things. This is the way we've always done. God, this is the way you always work, and nothing can be different. Because when we do that, we're going to end up like Moses and run a race and not be able to enter into everything that God has for us.